All right, so if you got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Galatians chapter 6, and we're going to look at verse 1 through 5. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 through 5. We are coming to the end of our study of Galatians. You can probably see, like mine, chapter 6 is all on one page, so we're like right there at the end of it. And some of y'all are probably saying, all right, when are we going to the next thing? Because we've been in Galatians for a while, but we're almost done, and we'll finish it up this month. And one big thing that Paul's been talking about is that we can rest in the grace that God gives us through Jesus Christ and what He did for us. And because of that, we don't have to earn our salvation. He freely gives us salvation. All we have to do is accept that through the faith that in His works. This morning, he's going to remind us that as a church, that we're in this together. You realize that? We come together as a group of believers and we're going through life together. Each one of us have different things that happen in our lives, but we're all going through it together. There was a commercial years ago, so for my young ones, y'all won't get this unless you watch maybe like TV Land or something like that. But it was an elderly woman that lived at home by herself, and she had this device that she wore around her neck. And one day she fell, and she pressed the button on her device, and what was the words that she said? Help, I've fallen and I can't get up. Y'all all remember that, right? Paul... Yeah, no, I won't go there. Okay. Paul is going to tell us that we need to be a life alert for other believers. That other believers should be able to say, help, I've fallen and I can't get up. And that we come alongside them and we help them up. Our big idea on your listening guide is loving your neighbor means helping them to bear their burdens with gentleness. Loving your neighbor means helping them to bear their burdens with gentleness. So let's go ahead and get started. Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to himself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. All right, so let's stop there. We'll start going through this. The first point on your listening guide is followers of Christ are called to help carry each other's burdens. Followers of Christ are called to help carry each other's burdens. Paul starts this passage out by saying, brethren, brothers, meaning that you've accepted Christ, you're part of the family of God. So it's brothers and sisters in Christ. He's talking to the church. The church is a family. In fact, verse 10 of this chapter, we're going to see, he calls the church a household of faith, meaning that we all come together as members of that household. You won't have the same interest as everybody else. Just like we don't have the same interest as everybody else, each person has different interests. In fact, you may even have in the church body, in your family, you always have that one uncle or that one aunt or great uncle that's just kind of off kilter a little bit, and you just kind of deal with them. I'm going to pay for this one later with my mom. I've shared this with our Sunday night crowd, but I'm going to share it with our Sunday morning crowd. I had an aunt. Her name was Aunt Maud. And Aunt Maud, she would come over to my grandma's house, and we were there, and she would sit on the couch. And as she was sitting on the couch, she would want each of us to come up and give her a hug and give her a kiss. And y'all were like, what's the big deal about that? There's nothing... that's innocent, right? Aunt Maud had a habit that she did. Aunt Maud had a habit called two bros. How many of y'all know what two bros is? Younger generation, y'all have no clue what two bros is. Two bros is powdered snuff. powdered tobacco, to the point that you would use a spoon to be able to get it out of the container. And so Aunt Maud, wherever she went, some of y'all's faces is pretty good. Wherever she went, she always had a mason jar full of paper towels in it, and then she had black around her lips. And Aunt Maud would look at us and say, "Come here and give me a kiss." And we're like, she's part of the family, and my mom's like, "You need to go give her a hug." I said, "Do I have to really kiss her? She's your aunt." Church families like that too, right? Because there's a whole different people in here. So many different people, so many different types of people, so many different habits and all of that we're all different. But the thing is, we have one thing in common, and that one thing can bring us all together. And that one thing is that if you're in the family of God, that means you have been redeemed by the blood of Christ. And that brings us all together. And all the differences that we have, even the ones that we wish we could just, keep you at arm's length away, all of that goes away because of the blood of Christ and that we're redeemed through Christ. And so Paul, he is writing to the family, and he's saying that you're a family and that you should come together. And he talks about you should come together when somebody is having a hard time. And one of the hard times that he mentions here is in verse 1. And he says, "And if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted." And so what he's saying is that when somebody's caught in a trespass meant transgressing what God would say. So this is somebody who is stepping out of God's will for their life is what's happening. And he says that when you see somebody like that, and the way he words it, he says, anyone caught in any trespass. And that caught up in means it's a pattern. The pattern started now, and it's not just a one-time thing, but this is a pattern of somebody stepping outside of God's will. And if you know somebody that's like that you're supposed to come beside them, and you're supposed to restore them. You're supposed to care about them enough that you will come beside them and to restore them so that they can come back into fellowship. They can come back into God's will. And so that they stop leaving God's will, is what he's trying to tell us here. And the idea, he says, is this is supposed to be done gently restoring them. This word restore, it was a term that meant that you were supposed to take something that was broken and put it back in place. It's a medical term for them, so it meant that you could take a broken bone and you're going to put it back in place. Well, now think about it. When you break a bone, there's pain there because you got the broken bone, right? But there's that pain of the break itself, but then there's also pain of putting it back in place so that you have to set the bone and then put a cast on it. And that can be just as painful as breaking the bone because you're realigning the bone. But that pain is a good pain because that shows the healing's about to start. And so he's saying that he knows there's going to be pain in this, in restoring this, but he says, do it gently. One surgery John Michael had when we were out in Texas, we go to the doctor, Dr. Thomas, and after the surgery, we came in for the checkup, and Dr. Thomas is there, and he's going to start taking the bandages off because he told us to leave the bandages on, and he's starting to take them off. And there's some bandages that are right on the top of his head, and they have stuck into his hair, and they're not moving at all. And so Dr. Thomas looks at us, and he looks at John Michael, and he says, "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way." And we're like, okay, what's the easy way, what's the hard way? He said, well, the hard way is I take my time and we just work on this. And he had been taking his time working on it, and it had been taking forever. He said, we can do it the easy way, and I just yank it. He said, I'm just going to yank it. And he yanked it, and when he yanked it, he realized there was more hair there than he thought, and there was more skin there than he thought. And John Michaels, his face was like, ah, and he was like, the tears were starting to just well up. And that doctor felt about this tall because he had just yanked it and he had just caused severe pain to him. We can do the same, you realize that? We can see somebody that's fallen away from God's will and we can come up to them and we can just beat them over the head and do it as hard as we can. And we actually do more harm sometimes than actually coming beside them and as Paul says, gently restore them. Not banging them over the head, but gently restoring them. But he also says in here, at the end of verse 1, he says, and each one looking to himself so that you will not be tempted also. You're going to gently restore them so that you're not tempted. That kind of has a dual meaning, that one part of this doing it gently is you're not looking at the person and you're not saying to the person, well, that would never happen to me. I would never do that. Because as soon as you say, well, that would never happen to me, guess what? You just open yourself up for it to happen to you. So one part of that gentleness is that you're not looking down on the person. But then the other part that he's talking about is make sure that it doesn't happen to you. Have that awareness that I've got to be careful myself so that this doesn't happen to me too. Don't come in arrogant, but be humble and say that I could easily have done this too. And let me help restore you. Then we get to verse 2. Verse 2, and he says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Well, now, the bear one another's burdens by the law of Christ, going back to chapter 5, he said that we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. So he's saying that we should bear one another's burdens. We should love our neighbors. Bearing somebody's burden means you're stepping in to help them out, right? You can't bear somebody's burden just kind of at an arm's length away. You can't just look at somebody and help bear somebody's burdens. But bearing somebody's burden means you're coming alongside them and you're helping them all the way through. Thursday, Joey and I went to see Kelly, and we saw Marianne and Eddie, and I said, Marianne and Eddie, I'm gonna talk about y'all on Sunday. And they said, all right. They didn't really know what I was going to talk about. But we know that Kelly had a massive stroke to the point where we weren't sure she was going to make it. And the first part of bearing burdens is we couldn't do anything at that point in time because she was in the hospital. So one part of that is that we were all lifting her up in prayer. In fact, Paul says in verse 1, he says, you who are spiritual, meaning that you need to be a spiritual side to burdens and there's a physical side to burdens, and you need to concentrate on the spiritual and the physical at the same time. And one part that we were doing as a church is we were lifting her up in prayer and praying for her. And then she got to the point where she got to go to rehab. And then she got to the point where she got to come home. And Marianne and Eddie, y'all stepped in to help her with her burdens because y'all provided a place. Now, I know your parents and every parent would welcome their kids back, but at the same time, you were lifting her up and helping her with her burdens. But not just y'all, but then we're like, what can we do as a church to help y'all? And y'all said we need a ramp. So the guys got together and they built a ramp for her, and she's able to get in and out of the house now. So that was one part of bearing the burdens. Another is, I said, what else can we do? When you get home, what do you need? And Eddie said, I said, can we do some food for you? And he said, well, maybe a week. And I said, all right. So I announced to y'all we need volunteers for food for a week. That was gone quick. I had more people coming and saying, we want more dates so that we can do it. And I said, well, can we do another week? Well, sure. I don't know if my waistline can take it, but yes, you can do that. So then we were providing more food for them. I heard people say that if you need me to sit with her, that I'll sit with her. That's bearing somebody's burdens. That's coming along somebody and lifting them up and helping them through. And see, there's a part of bearing the burdens that's the fun part too, is because we've gotten to celebrate in how God has been working with Kelly. That the doctors never thought she'd be able to stand. She can stand. Doctors never thought she'd be able to take a step. We got videos showing her taking a step. And we can celebrate in that because we as a church have come together and helped with the burden part. Now, I know it's a long ways to go, but she has come so long. And I'm glad that we have been there to help bear that burden. But followers of Christ, we're called to carry each other's burdens. But that leads us to the second point on your listening guide is prepare to be a burden bearer. Prepare to be a burden bearer. We can see this starting back in verse 2 through verse 5. It says, bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not in regard to another. For each one will bear his own load. So now Paul is going to talk about that you've got to be prepared to be a burden bearer. So for you to bear other people's burdens, you first have to prepare yourself. You have to have a proper view of yourself. You have to know yourself. And I like what he says here in verse 3. He says, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. What he's talking about there is the Judaizers, they thought they were following God's law to the T, and they felt like they were earning their salvation and that nobody could say anything bad about them. They knew they were good, is basically what Paul is saying here. They knew they were working their way into heaven. Paul was once like them. In fact, in Philippians chapter 3, he talks about, if you want to talk about a Jew, I was the Jew among the Jews. I was a Pharisee. I was one of the best. As Joey says, I was the man. But then he said, if you count all that as rubbish, garbage. And actually, the Greek word means human waste. Because that wasn't getting them God's grace. That wasn't getting them salvation. Paul's saying we need to know ourselves. We need to have a good view of ourselves. The Judaizers, they thought they were good, but they weren't. Because they were trying to work their ways to heaven, and we can't work our way to heaven. It's only through grace that God gives us by Jesus dying on the cross for us. Paul wants them and us to take an honest look at our lives and realize that we need Christ. You realize that? We need Christ. Each and every day we need Christ. Jesus said in John chapter 15, verse 5, he said, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. You realize that? Apart from Jesus, we can't even help ourselves. Spiritually, we can't help ourselves. We need him. Then we get to verse 4, and it seems a little bit like verse 3 and verse 4 are kind of contradicting each other. Verse 4, it says, but each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not in regard to another. So verse 3 is talking about don't deceive yourself, don't think too much of yourself. And then verse 4, he's talking about boasting in yourself. So what is he talking about here? Well, the boasting is about what God has done in your life. You're boasting about what Jesus has done in your life. And I've been here long enough that I'm starting to know some of y'all's stories. And I'm starting to know how God has worked in your lives. And how God has changed some of y'all radically from how you were until how you are today. And here's what I would say about that. You boast in that. And you're not boasting that you did something really good. You're boasting that God did something in your life. And you're using your testimony to point people towards Jesus. And that's what he's saying here. Boast in what God has done for your life, in your life? What has he done for you? The second is that he's talking about boast in to himself alone and not in regards to another. Don't compare yourself to other people. God has a plan for each one of us, which means that when we accomplish that plan, we boast about what God's done in our lives. And you can't compare yourself to somebody else because God may have one plan for one person and a different plan for somebody else. I can remember when we got back from Texas and we would talk to people and they would say, I can't believe that you sold your house, moved halfway across the country to go to seminary. There's no way I could do that. Well, you couldn't do that because that's not God's plan for your life. That's what he had called us to do, and that's not what he called you to do. Just like we knew a family who sold everything, and when I say they sold everything down to suitcases, and they moved to South Africa. And I was like, Shannon, there's no way I'm moving to South Africa. And she's like, you got that right. There's no way we are, because that's, halfway across the country is one thing, but when you're starting moving continents, that's a big jump, right? And so if I would have compared myself to that family, I would have said, well, we're a failure because we're not willing to make that commitment. God hadn't called us to make that commitment. God called them to make that commitment. There was a group of church planners that were talking at one of the meetings at the Greenville Baptist Association. And they said what their church sends out church planners. And what they do is they ask for commitments from not just one family, but multiple families, like up to 6 families that will move to a neighborhood in a different state so that they can start up a church for that area. That's a huge commitment, is it not? And I'm like, I don't know if I could do that. But God hasn't called me to do that. And so if I start to compare myself to somebody else, then I may think I'm better than somebody else, which is not the case, or I could think I'm a failure compared to somebody else. Paul's saying, do what God has for you to do. Look at yourself alone, not what God has called somebody else to do. Then we get to verse 5. Verse 5, and he says, for each one will bear his own load. Now, if you compare verse 2 to verse 5, it seems like that he's contradicting himself again. Because verse 3 is like, don't boast too much. Verse 4 is like, boast in what God's done. Then you get to verse 5, and he says, you need to carry your own load. But verse 2 says, bear one another's burdens. What in the world is Paul talking about here? When you dive down into the Greek, you can see what he's talking about here. Verse 2 is carrying each other's burdens. That word for burdens is a heavy load, a load that you can't carry by yourselves. You ever gone to the store and you go to pick up the box, and the box has on the bottom of it, 2 people must pick up? That's the idea here, is that you can't do it on your own in verse 2 of the bearing somebody's burdens. But verse 5, it says, for each one will bear his own load. What he's talking about there is, in the Greek, this is more like a pack that somebody would wear, like a backpack that kids would wear to school. That's what he's talking about here. And that we're supposed to carry our own load, but also help people with their burdens, their heavy loads. So then the next thing is, okay, well then what is a burden compared to what's a load? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples, and I kind of went to extremes so that way you can see it, but then you can kind of fill in and figure out where I'm going with this. How many of y'all have a hard time waking up in the morning? The alarm clock can go and you just hit snooze, and you hit snooze, and you hit snooze. Other people, they're just morning people. The alarm goes off and they're up. That's me. The alarm goes off, I'm ready to go. It's time to get up. Shannon, if she could hit snooze, she would hit snooze. Everybody knows that you don't wake her up unless you absolutely have to. That's the difference. That's the way God made us. Our daughter is following along with Shannon. You don't go in her room to wake her up if you don't have to. So let's say that you get a job and you've got to be there early and you're always hitting the snooze button, so then you start to show up to work late to the point that your boss has come to you and said, look, you got to do something. You got to start showing up on time or I'm going to have to get rid of you. So then you think to yourself, well, what should I do about this? I know, I'll get my friend to call me. That way I know that I'll get up. So you ask a friend to call you in the morning, early in the morning, to wake up so that you can get up. You don't need to do that. That's a load. That's your own thing. You should be doing this yourself. If you need one alarm clock, then get one alarm clock. If you need 2 alarm clocks, then get you 2 alarm clocks. They even have alarm clocks now that it's almost like a light built into it, and the light just gradually grows until it's really bright, like a sunlight that's shining in on you. But you can do that on your own. That's your own load that you should be carrying. You should be able to wake yourself up in the morning so that you can get to work. Now, some of y'all are looking at me like, yeah, right. That's a load. That's something you can bear yourself. Right now, we're currently, depending on who you talk to, we're either in a recession or we're heading to a recession. And with recessions usually happens, our layoffs start to happen. And let's say that you're working and then one day your boss calls you in and says, I'm sorry, but I've got to let you go. And you've still got all your bills that you've got to pay, and you're going out and you're looking for work and you're trying to find something, but you can't find anything and bills are coming due and there's nothing you can do. You're doing everything you can. That's a burden. That's one where the church can come in and say, what can we do to help you out? Because you didn't do anything to cause you to be laid off. And you're trying everything you can to find another job. But at the same time, there's a burden that you're going through right then. That's the difference between a load and a burden. Does that make sense? But then there's another thing with this too. A lot of people will try to take a burden and put it in their backpack and try to carry it around themselves. They're like, I can handle this on my own. I don't need to get anybody else involved. I can handle this on my own, knowing that this is a burden and it's going to break you down if you don't have anybody helping you. Paul's saying that when those burdens come, don't go through those by yourselves. Don't be trying to put those in your backpack. Instead, bring them towards the church. Ask the church to pray. And that prayer may lead to other things to happen also. But don't try to carry your burden around by yourselves. Some of you today might be trying to carry your burden around by yourselves. You're not meant to do that. Our bottom line is very simple. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourselves. One way to show them that you love them is to come alongside them and to help them carry the burdens that they're carrying. But for people to be able to know about the burdens, you got to tell them about them. You got to share with what's going on in your lives. It may be your response today is you just need to come to the altar and pray and say, Lord, you know the burden I've been carrying. Lord, if there's somebody here in this church that can help me with this, Lord, let me know. Or maybe it's the whole body together. But we're called to carry each other's burdens. But as you're also coming along and you see somebody that's kind of walking away from God's will, Paul said, watch yourself first, but then gently restore them. Maybe there's somebody you know that's walking away. And you've been wondering if God's been wanting you to do something. Maybe that your response is to pray and ask for that confirmation that God wants you to step in and gently restore them. Whatever your response is, I'll be down front. We'll be glad to pray with you. Let's close in prayer. Lord,